Almost every fridge in America has a block of cheese in it, be it cheddar or pepper jack or something a little more unique like blue cheese or queso fresco. And Oregon fridges are no different, except our cheese often comes from right down the road.
My favorite thing to do is make cheese.
Francisco Ochoa is the owner and head cheesemaker at Don Froilan Creamery in Salem.
My parents were looking for Mexican cheese in the markets, and unfortunately they couldn't find it. And that's how the business got started.
Ochoa and cheesemakers here specialize in artisan Mexican cheese. There's a rhythm to the way they make traditional Oaxacan queso. It's like watching ballet.
It's just a beautiful dance between two people of stretching the curds into long ribbons of queso Oaxaca.
Ochoa and his family used to travel around Oregon selling cheese and trying to find customers. But now they make America's best string cheese. And they're not the only ones here to achieve high praise. World-class cheese is all around us in Oregon. Think of one of our largest cheese producers, Tillamook.
We bring in 1.8 million pounds of milk into this facility every single day.
And Rogue.
I think it's arguable that Rogue might be the American creamery that really brought American blue cheeses to the world stage, especially winning Best Cheese in the World in 2019.
To some of our smaller producers, like Don Froilan and Helvetia.
Obviously, this small of a cheese operation is not my sole income. I have a day job.
Every great cheesemaker knows that it all starts with the land.
The biodiversity and the unique landscapes in Southern Oregon really sets this region apart. We have these beautiful verdant pastures, perfect for dairy farming.
From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. While we are surrounded by cheese in Oregon, many of us may not know what goes into making it and the history of cheese in the region. How has cheese shaped Oregon? We sent out an expert to investigate this exact question.
I'm Katie Osuna, and cheese is probably my favorite food. Not just because I think it's delicious, which obviously it is, but also because it's fascinating. Food has always been an important part of my life, but it wasn't until college that I really became obsessed with cheese. My junior year, I decided to do an honors thesis for my anthropology degree. And as someone who was focusing on food systems, I wanted to dig into how a product made its way from farm to table. And I ended up landing on cheese because of the way that humans have developed this product over the centuries, and how we continue to develop it. It is truly mind-boggling. For that thesis, I worked on cheese farms here and abroad, which eventually led me to working in the restaurant industry and 3-star Michelin restaurants. But my passion for the study of the forces that shape our meals inspired me to leave the restaurant industry and start my own podcast, Copper and Heat, exploring those forces. So now I do a lot of research on the history and culture of food, like how cheese is made. No one knows exactly how humans first discovered how to make cheese, but it's been around for over 7,000 years. And though some things look a little different nowadays, all cheese starts with the same basic ingredients.
You add cultures, which are bacteria and other microorganisms from previous successful cheese makes. You put those in the milk. What those are doing are creating acid and diversifying your flavor. You're building firmness and texture.
Michael Metters is a cheesemaker at Rogue Creamery in Southern Oregon. He says the bacteria, whether added or naturally occurring, go to work eating sugar or lactose in the milk, and this affects the acidity and flavor of the cheese. A coagulant called rennet is typically added, which makes the proteins and the fats in the milk stick together.
They weave a little net around all the water and all the fat, and then you can cut that.
Cheesemakers cut the curd into different sizes to change the amount of moisture in the final cheese. The curd is cut large or small and then stirred and cooked to release more moisture, separating the curds from the liquid whey. Finally, the curds are strained or put into molds to release even more whey. It's all about concentrating flavor and developing texture.
And there you have your cheese. You take it any direction you like. You can end up a million different places, even with just standard cow's milk with standard components.
But to really talk about cheese, we have to talk about what it comes from.
Cheese comes from milk. milk comes from livestock, domesticated animals.
That's Tammy Parr, an Oregon cheese historian. How did you get into cheese and cheese history specifically?
Yeah, it's a winding journey. Sort of in the early 2000s, at the time, blogs were a cool thing. So I started a blog. I guess now it'd be TikTok or whatever. But I started a blog called Pacific Northwest Cheese Project. I had always wanted to be a writer. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it.
I called Tammy up on Zoom to learn more about the history of cheese in the Pacific Northwest. I first learned about her in 2013 when she came out with a book called Pacific Northwest Cheese, A History. And yes, I did wait in a line to have Tammy sign my book back then. As it turns out, cheese has a very complex history.
Originally, there's no domesticated animals in the Western Hemisphere. So cheese making in the region, in the Western Hemisphere itself, doesn't happen until the Europeans start colonizing the Western Hemisphere, starting with Columbus sailing into the Caribbean in the late 1400s.
In other words, there was no cheese-making tradition amongst indigenous populations. The European settlers came in, took the land, and brought their European traditions with them.
Columbus, the Spanish settle the Caribbean, they settle Mexico, they go into South America, the southwestern United States. Meanwhile, England, France, the Dutch are coming and settling on the Atlantic seaboard, settling some of the colonies over there.
The settlers are bringing livestock with them, like cattle, sheep, and goats.
They're bringing cheese making, they're bringing dairying, they're bringing butter making, and all of the various fermented products and things that they made in their food traditions, they brought over too.
Tammy says this is where cheesemaking in the Western Hemisphere really starts. And it's all intertwined with colonialism and domesticated livestock. And to bring it closer to home here in the Pacific Northwest, the history of cheese starts in a fairly organized way.
First, earliest production was by the Hudson's Bay Company.
The Hudson's Bay Company was an enormous fur trade operation based out of London. As Tammy says in her book, the international custom of the 1800s was whichever nation first, quote-unquote, discovered the land and established it, i.e. built on it and brought in livestock, laid claim to it. And in the 1800s, executives at the Hudson's Bay Company built a post on the north bank of the Columbia River, near the site of present-day Vancouver, Washington. But there were already people living in the area who knew the land intimately. It might be hard to imagine what this landscape looked like, but local tribal members can give you an idea.
These large Wapato ponds and flats and lakes.
We had camas, and we had berries from the mountain. We had deer and elk. We had salmon. We had smelt.
It was an incredibly wealthy place. We had the ability to amass real quantities of goods that then we traded.
You were at the crossroads of the known world, in a world where trade was really most important.
That was Dave Harrelson, Mike Aiel, and Tony Johnson. They talked to OPB back in 2018 for an Oregon Experience documentary on Fort Vancouver. So, Fort Vancouver was a focal point of trade in what the company called its Columbia Department. The department stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast, as far north as Sitka, Alaska, and south to what would become San Francisco. And
Fort Vancouver starts to establish itself as a big farm. They develop livestock for meat, they set up fields for produce, and they set up dairies.
Tammy says this was a pretty significant dairy operation.
A woman, this is Narcissa Whitman, who visited the operation in the 1830s, says they're milking 60 cows, which is pretty amazing for a random outpost in the middle of nowhere. They're producing all kinds of butter and cheese.
And during this time, Tammy says the livestock white settlers are bringing starts to shift the environment. Livestock are eating the grass, there are new parasites, new prey to the land, and so on.
And as the humans introduce the livestock, they're creating farms in the European tradition. They're taking down trees, they're creating fields, they're doing all these sorts of things that aren't there. So the environmental changes are really, really significant.
Then came the Oregon Trail. The first American wagon train to arrive was in 1843, with close to 1,000 people. There were settlers, farmers, missionaries, and other migrants traveling west. Tammy says some people on the Oregon Trail even managed to bring cows, but it was a really tough endeavor because you had to feed them and protect them from predators.
The cheese making and the dairying, such that it was on the Oregon Trail, was pretty rudimentary, and it was a survival strategy. For a lot of people on the Oregon Trail, that was kind of a both a survival, we're going to eat this and we're going to survive because it's food, but also kind of a memory of home.
And as more settlers arrived that were not associated with the Hudson's Bay Company, the company started to lose control of the area for the British. And the US and England ended up divvying up the Northwest. And the Hudson's Bay Company moved its operations to Vancouver Island, taking their massive farming operations with them. This may have been the end of the first large-scale dairy operation in the Northwest, but it was just the beginning of a burgeoning cheese industry in what would become Oregon.
Coming up after a break, how Oregon cheese became so special. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you like what you hear, you know you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and exciting and delicious to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on everything Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about how cheese shaped Oregon and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. Not to be cheesy, but I am so grateful for y'all. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show.
As people from the Oregon Trail settled the Oregon Territory, how did cheese, a food made for survival in a wild and unknown territory, grow into a commercial endeavor?
I mean, in some ways, almost immediately, in that, once you got here, if you had the skills, if you knew how to make cheese, if you had access to milk, you could immediately make cheese for yourself and your family, if you had a family, or you could make cheese and sell it right away.
At the turn of the century, many Swiss immigrants came via the Oregon Trail and settled in Helvetia. It was remote, but they found the mild climate was perfect for grazing cattle. To survive, they stuck with what they knew: dairy farming. Dave Grosson's great-grandfather was one of those early settlers.
He immigrated from Switzerland in the late 1880s. With 2 brothers, they landed in Kansas, kind of along the Oregon Trail. My great-granddad and his wife and his newborn son, they made their way out here to Helvetia. But it was a small Swiss community that was close to Portland, where they could easily sell their farm goods into town.
His great-grandfather brought the tradition of making Swiss Alpine cheese from the brown Swiss cows they milked. 4 generations later, they are still doing the same work in Helvetia, which means Switzerland in Latin.
Normally I would start at like 4:30, try to be done there at 7.
Right now, I'm in the cheesemake room, a small, steamy room with white walls, white floors, and stainless steel equipment built inside a barn. A door behind the cheese vat leads into the milking parlor, where Dave milks his small herd of cows every morning.
This is 1940s milking technology here.
Yet, Tammy Parr, the cheese historian, says that during the late 1800s and early 1900s, factory cheesemaking on the East Coast was already well underway.
And really, Oregon and the Pacific Northwest is catching up to what's already happening.
The best-known cheese producer in Oregon is Tillamook. You've probably heard of their cheddar cheese. It can be found in grocery stores all over the country. The company's history stretches back to the late 1800s. The Tillamook region, with its abundant natural resources, was home to the Tillamook people. In the early 1800s, Lewis and Clark wrote in their journals that 2,400 Tillamooks lived in the region. By the 1830s, diseases that the white settlers brought killed many of them. And by the 1850s, some Tillamook people were removed to the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations. But now, the Tillamook region is best known for cheese and dairy. The city logo is a cow, and even the high school mascot is called the Cheesemaker. Jill Allen is the Director of Product Excellence at Tillamook Creamery.
It is a very wet region that creates beautiful lush grass, that creates beautiful milk, that in turn creates award-winning cheddars.
In 2024, one of Tillamook's cheeses was named the best cheddar in the world. Early settlers also recognized the land for its abundance and, specifically, its potential for dairy farming. But it was far from other white settlements. They needed a sailing ship to get to markets.
In 1854, The Tillamook settlers created the Morning Star, and that was to help us transport our dairy products from Tillamook over to the Portland area so that they could sell their dairy products, specifically cheese and butter.
And what started as a way for small farmers to pool resources has grown into Oregon's most recognizable cheese brand.
Tillamook's been making cheddar cheese for 116 years. So we, in theory, have been using that same recipe. We've had a few modernizations along the way, as you've seen our Cheddar Master.
Cheddar cheese is named for the English village of Cheddar, where the process of cheddaring was first invented, a method that involves packing curds together into big blocks and then flipping them by hand. But at the scale that Tillamook makes cheese, that looks a little bit different.
We bring in 1.8 million pounds of milk into this facility every single day. So the curds and whey will be gently pumped over to our Cheddar Master, and that's where it's taking out the manual piece of flipping the cheddar mats and draining the whey from the curds.
By the early 1900s, 1920s or so, Tillamook is starting to become known up and down the West Coast as a brand.
That's cheese historian Tammy Parr again. The flow of European-descended settlers working the fields, forests, mines, and waterways provided a hungry market for a burgeoning industry. And cheese in Oregon at this time gets even more interesting.
So we were importing a lot of cheese, and so starting around World War I, imports started declining. People are focused on making cheese in Europe, and it's way, way too expensive to bring in. So people started to think about how can we create those cheeses for domestic demand.
Tammy says the U.S. Department of Agriculture started researching how to make different kinds of traditional European cheeses. For example, how does blue cheese become blue cheese?
And so partly that stimulated the United States cheese industry.
During World War I and II, the United States started paying cheesemakers to produce a lot of cheese. It was for
the war effort to be sent to soldiers abroad, especially in World War II. Tillamook really, really ramped up its production during World War II because of that. And so cheese making goes crazy after World War II. However, there's also a real fall off after World War II ends. And there's kind of an agriculture depression after that because you have a lot of supply and no demand. But that does expand cheese making considerably from the teens through the 1940s.
And there's some technological advances happening around that time too, like canning. People were trying to can everything because it was a way to preserve all kinds of foods. So people thought, why not put cheese in a can?
So they created Washington State Creamery, which you can still purchase today, and it's really good. But the canned cheese thing didn't really get too far in terms of being a national way to produce cheese, unfortunately, because pretty soon after that started the invention of and innovations in terms of plastic and wrapping and different things like that.
I know, I still love Cougar Gold, so.
It's awesome. No, Cougar Gold is the best. And, it's a little slice of history there.
Cougar Gold is the canned cheese we're referring to that Washington State University still makes. And before you think that canned cheese sounds weird, you have to try it first. It's a really delicious cheddar in a can. Today in Southern Oregon, the land, cows, and cultures work together to create a completely different style of cheese. Rogue Creamery is famous for their blue cheese. They won the world's best cheese in 2019 for their Rogue River Blue. And there's something really special going on with blue cheese.
Blue cheese has an intensity of flavor that you can't really get out of any other style.
Marguerite Merritt is the cheese emissary and brand manager at Rogue Creamery. Rogue got its start in the 1930s when an entrepreneur from Portland worked with the city of Central Point to create the region's first creamery cooperative.
In the early 1900s, through the Depression years, dairy was integral to this valley's success. In 1933, a creamery cooperative was formed to create a resource where farmers could bring their milk to create a value-added product called the Rogue River Valley Creamery Cooperative in 1933, and that was when the Rogue Creamery facility was built.
Before we go any further, what is blue cheese? Well, it's all about mold.
So blue cheese is created by adding a culture to the milk as the curds begin to form. As the wheels of cheese age, the veins of blue begin to develop. So we need to perforate each wheel to allow oxygen to get into the interior of the wheel to allow that veining to develop.
The cultures are so important that sometimes they're secret and sometimes they're proprietary.
So this part of the Rogue Creamery history is shrouded in a bit of mystery.
Marguerite says it all started around World War II, when the company's founder, Tom Vella, decided to travel to Roquefort, France. The founder thought he could make a superior blue cheese that the US market had not seen before.
We don't know exactly how Tom Vella came back from Roquefort with the secrets of blue cheese making, but it happened, and he came back with the cultures. Of course, after inoculating the new facility here, the cultures began to evolve, and now our cultures are completely unique to our own facility and region. This is a living culture. And what we have today is completely unique to our own recipe.
In the 1900s, Oregon was a top producer of cheese in the Northwest. And since then, dairying has been a top agricultural business in the region. And while Oregon doesn't produce the quantity of cheese like Wisconsin, Idaho, or other leading states do today, Oregon punches above its weight class in the ways that cheese makes an impact.
My favorite thing to do is make cheese.
Francisco Ochoa is the owner and head cheesemaker at Don Froilan. His family moved to Oregon from Mexico when he was around 14 years old.
My parents were looking for Mexican cheese in the markets, and unfortunately they couldn't find it. And that's how the business got started.
Francisco and Lisa Ochoa have owned Don Froilan since 2009 with the goal of bringing more artisan Mexican-style cheeses to the U.S. But the business goes back even further, to Francisco's father, Froilan Ochoa, who started making cheese with his family in the late 90s. It was all done in their Oregon kitchen. Neighbors found out and wanted to buy cheese from them. And soon enough, the whole community started buying their homemade batches.
My memory of watching him make cheese with his father and his mom was, these stainless steel tubs that they would use, and just watching their hands in the curd, to feel when it was ready. I was just a teenager, but I was just like, wow, this is so hands-on. Literally, their heart and soul was in this cheese making.
The company now produces the best string cheese in America, and it's made with traditional Oaxacan techniques.
Hand pulling the cheese gives it a texture like no other. That's something that the machines just can't do. They can't replicate.
Decades later, the Ochoas, like many cheesemakers in the region, still hold tight to family values. They don't compromise on quality.
Keeping those traditions alive and, keeping the tradition of culture of Mexican cheesemaking, made the way it's supposed to be made is something the world should see.
Ochoa knows how hard the barriers can be. So Don Froilan Creamery is paying it forward by sharing its production facility with smaller cheese businesses, especially cheesemakers from different cultures.
We want to give the opportunity to other people to make cheese and be able to do what we did.
They share their space with La Mariposa.
They make an Argentine cheese and great cheeses.
And Jaffa Cheese Co.
They're big Mediterranean labne.
Oregon is a home for many cheesemakers. That's the future of Oregon in the cheese industry, is creating diversity of cheese.
The future cheesemakers of Oregon and the Northwest will find themselves part of a long tradition that continues to evolve. Though European colonization is the history of cheese in the region, cheesemakers from places like Mexico, India, and Lebanon are bringing their own traditions and flavors. Cheese helped build the Oregon that we know today, and it will mold what it will look like in the future.
You can find a link to a cheese documentary Katie Osuna helped produce for OPB's Super Abundant in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Mia Estrada produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. The OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier and Sage Van Wing. Katie Osuna, Ricardo Osuna, Rachel Palmer, Stephanie Gordon, Crystal Ligori, Beth Harrington, and Mia Estrada did the interviews you heard. And a special thanks to Katie Osuna, Ricardo Osuna, and Rachel Palmer of the Copper and Heat podcast for collaborating with us on this episode. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And hey, if you have a question for us, please reach out. Email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.
Working on my night cheese. Jack? Do you know what time it is? I was sound asleep.
I heard you singing night cheese.
64 slices of American cheese.